So thank you all for coming out. This is an exciting evening. There we have a couple of speeches and awards and so on before we move to our main event. I want to begin by just saying that this year marks the 25th birthday of the Kensei Foundation. I just wanted to, I'm going to ask Ken Jolie, who's been the director for these 25 years, to come up and speak. Before she comes, I just want to add a few words of my own, if that's all right, celebrating this quarter century of real vision and generosity that have reshaped the whole academic study of Buddhism worldwide, and definitely here at UC Berkeley, enriched our educational program in really countless ways. And in 2006, the foundation established its first endowed chair here at Berkeley, which brought the study of Tibetan Buddhism here. It had long been a major center for Buddhist studies, but adding Tibetan studies was a major event. And then over my own 17 years of teaching here at Berkeley, this endowment has made possible all sorts of lectureships, such as tonight, graduate and undergraduate fellowships and awards, as we will see tonight, and sustained research projects. And then, of course, meanwhile, well beyond Berkeley, KF, as they call it, the Kensei Foundation, has nurtured Buddhist studies programs across continents, endowing further professorships from Michigan to Munich, Sydney, Australia to Thailand, sponsoring countless conferences and publications and fostering collaborations between universities and monastic institutions, all of which have helped to broaden and deepen the field as a whole. At Berkeley, its support has helped make our campus a vibrant hub for the study of Buddhism, where we try to combine rigorous scholarship and living traditions, meeting in our classrooms. So today's event honors not only the 25 years of philanthropy, but the transformation of an entire field of study that's been made possible by the Kensei Foundation's unwavering commitment to wisdom and learning. I also just want to say, before handing it over to Ken Jolie, I'm not repeating everything you're about to say, but I just want to make you aware of an event that's happening in a couple of weeks, which is in honor of Stephen Goodman. After his passing, the Kensei Foundation instituted a lecture series, the Goodman Lectures, and I think this will be the last in that series. I think? No? Okay. Well, it's okay. Anyway, it's being given by Donald Lopez, who gave the first in the series, and Stephen Goodman. Many of you probably know him, but he received his BA here and taught at CIIS in San Francisco. So this event is scheduled for March 6th, one day after Stephen's birthday. And I think it'll take place at 4 or 4:30?
It's Zoomed and it's live.
It's Zoomed
and?
and?
The live part will be at CIIS on Mission Street.
Yep.
And the Zoom will be just register on the Kensei Foundation website.
Thank you. And CIIS, in case you're wondering, is the California Institute for Integral Studies. So please attend that too if you're interested. Okay, Ken Jolie, please come up and thank you.
Thank you, Jake, for a very nice introduction. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, this year, as Jake mentioned, we celebrate Kensei Foundation's 25 years of serving the Dharma. The foundation was set up in year 2001 as a very small nonprofit with the idea of pooling some resources to support Buddhist monasteries and institutions in the Himalayas. But it became quickly very clear that we had to expand the scope and the mission in order to fulfill the vast vision of our founder and our guiding light, our North Star, Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche. So today, Kensei Foundation is a global and non-sectarian Buddhist organization with patrons and volunteers, grant recipients and supporters from almost 40 countries. We are finding our ways to share the wisdom of the Buddha and to spread the Dharma. As many of you are aware, as Jake mentioned, one of the major efforts of the foundation is to support academic development. Our founder, Trungsa Khyentse Rinpoche, believes, and he says that academia is the guardian of Buddha Dharma, because universities are known for rigorous objective study, and if Buddhism undergoes such a thorough examination, it can benefit not only the students, but Buddhism itself. He is an advocate of supporting Buddhist studies in Western media, academia, as he recognizes the importance in preserving and propagating the authentic Buddhism as Buddhism moves out of its traditional countries to the West. So, as Jake mentioned, in year 2006, almost 2 decades ago, the foundation established our first Khyentse professorship in Buddhist studies right here in UC Berkeley, and we are glad to have Jake Dalton fulfilling that position for the past 17 years. For some of you, and I actually know that some of you were here with us in August of year 2006, and we remember the encouraging remark by your then Vice Chancellor saying that with the addition of the new professorship in Tibetan Buddhism, UC Berkeley will have one of the strongest faculties in Buddhist studies outside of Asia. And also in his excitement, Rinpoche famously said, "I feel with this one contribution, we have started the equivalent of 100 monasteries." And fast forward to year 2026, now we have sponsored a total of 7 professorships, as Jay mentioned earlier. 2 in North America, in Berkeley and University of Michigan, 2 in Asia, with the National University of Singapore and the International Buddhist College in Thailand. We have 1 in the University of Sydney, Australia, 1 in Europe, the Munich University, and also 1 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In addition, we have supported Buddhist study centers in different places, significantly at the University of Hamburg and elsewhere. And we have offered numerous scholarships and grants, financial support for many undergraduates and graduate students, making an impact in strengthening Buddhist studies outside the traditionally Buddhist countries. And we will have an awardee, I think, for student excellence at Berkeley later today. Khyentse Foundation dwells in the joy of offering. As a foundation, our only purpose is to support people and projects that help to share the wisdom of the Buddha. We base our work on Buddhist principles and try to apply the Buddhist teachings in our daily operations. We constantly remind ourselves, especially of the 3 supreme methods in Buddhism, which is to have, whatever we do, we need to have good motivation, to put in our best effort, but always aware that everything is actually an illusion. And finally, not to be attached to results, but dedicate the merit of whatever we do for the benefit of all sentient beings. And while we try to be as professional as possible as a foundation, the element of dedication and devotion in working for the Dharma is like the heart and lung and blood of our organization. That's the most important to us. So following Rinpoche's vision for supporting Buddhism as a way of bettering our world, in the past 20 years, apart from some achievements in academic development that we mentioned and supporting many traditional monasteries, I think the foundation has made big strides in some very important areas. We preserve and digitize millions of pages of Buddhist texts through the work of organizations like the BDRC and Fraser Poundis and others. We help or promote the translation of precious Buddhist texts by fostering important translation endeavors, including the 84,000 translating the words of the Buddha, the Kumara Jiva Project, and the Kensei Vision Project, and others, which help to translate Buddhist texts into different languages. We have been supporting many practitioners, students, Buddhist teachers throughout the world with really thousands of scholarships and grants. And more recently, you might have heard, we have made a very major effort in developing Buddhist education for children based on Buddhist principles. Now, with the combined effort of so many, much have actually really been achieved by the Foundation in the past 25 years. Much more than I can go into in detail tonight without boring you. You are welcome to join us in our efforts, and please visit our website if you need more information. I just want to take this opportunity as we celebrate Kensei Foundation's 25th anniversary and on the occasion of our annual Kensei lecture here in Berkeley, now in its 17th year, to express my heartfelt appreciation on behalf of Zongsa Khyentse Rinpoche and all of us at Kensei Foundation to some of our long-term partners here on campus, just to name a few. Professor Bob Schaaf, our Kensei Chair Jay Dalton, Professor Alex von Rosberg, Sanjay, and of course our speaker today, Dr. Lucantis, many others, too many to mention, whose dedication has brought one of the best programs in Buddhist studies to UC Berkeley, making it available to the next generation of young scholars and practitioners from the US and the world over. So congratulations on your good work. You make this happen for Kensei Foundation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kenjoli, and thank you for all your good work. It's been a pleasure. So each year before the lecture, we give our Kensei Award for Excellence in Buddhist Studies to an undergraduate. And this year, our awardee is Nick Heitman. You want to come up and stand here while I embarrass you? Nick is, he grew up in Michigan, in Troy, Michigan, which is nice because several of us studied in Michigan, where his family still lives. He started at Oakland Community College, which I was shocked to learn is not in Oakland, but in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Correct. And I guess after 2 years anyway, he got an associate's degree there and then transferred to Berkeley, where he has since been a straight A student, now a junior, graduating next spring. Better yet, he's actually majoring in South and Southeast Asian studies and minoring in Buddhist studies, so he's really all in here. We often have pre-med and computer science minoring in Buddhism, but he's going all the way. So in preparation for this little introduction, he told me how his interest in Buddhism dates back to his time in Michigan when he discovered a Thai Buddhist vihara near his home. Unfortunately, he told me, language barriers prevented deep conversations with the monks, and they couldn't teach him meditation directly. However, upon leaving, he said, they gifted me a CD of 11-hour-long Dhamma talks. That gift was a substantial turning point for me, for which I feel deeply grateful to them, end quote. At Berkeley, he's already begun studying Sanskrit and has been supplementing this by studying Pali on his own. He also completed coursework in Japanese language in his freshman and sophomore years, I guess back in Michigan. He says, looking forward, following graduation, he intends to pursue a PhD. His goal is to conduct research on early sutra material, as well as contemporary conversations on early Buddhism, contemporary society, and other modern fields such as neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology. So maybe Sydney, as the representative of the Kensei Foundation, can come and give him the award officially. Thank you. the main event. So it's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker for our 17th annual Kensei Lecture. Christian Lusenetz is one of the leading historians of Tibetan and Buddhist art of his generation. Christian studied Tibetan and Buddhist studies at the Institute of Tibetan and Buddhist Studies at the University of Vienna, where he completed his PhD under the external supervision of the late Maurizio Taddei, of the Istituto Universitario Orientale in Napoli. We have a number of Italians in our program now, so I have to perform. He subsequently held research positions at the University of Vienna, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the Lumbini International Research Institute, establishing himself early on as a scholar whose work moves fluently between philology, archaeology, and art history. His career has also taken him to many of the institutions that shape our field. He's held visiting professorships here at UC Berkeley in 2004-05, and again in spring of 2010, as well as in Berlin, Stanford University, and he served as a senior curator at the Rubin Museum of Art in New York from 2010 to 2014, where he helped shape a new public understanding of Himalayan art there. Just to give you a sense of some of the projects he's worked on while in Berlin, he co-curated a landmark exhibition called Gandhara, the Buddhist Heritage of Pakistan, Legends, Monasteries, and Paradise. That was actually in Bonn. And was responsible for its catalog, bringing together archaeological discovery, historical nuance, and visual analysis in his usual exemplary way. His primary research focuses on early Tibetan Buddhist art from the 7th to 15th centuries, but also on early Buddhist art during and after the Kushana period in India from the 1st to 5th centuries. His specific topics range from representations of the Bodhisattva and the future Buddha Maitreya and their relationship to the development of Mahayana Buddhism to the emergence of Indian esoteric forms and their adoption and adaptation in Tibet. I'm sure we'll see some of that tonight. His publications include, with countless articles, are also two volumes I wanted to mention: Buddhist Sculpture in Clay, Early Western Himalayan Art, Late 10th to Early 13th Centuries, published by Serindia in 2004, and more recently his two illuminated text collections of Namgyal Monastery, a study of early Buddhist art and literature in Mustang, published in 2022, both of which have become standard points of reference for anyone working on Western Himalayan visual culture. His work on those same regions of the Western Himalayas has done a lot, not only for modern scholars, but for the local communities themselves. And I wanted to highlight this as the principal investigator of an AHRC English funded project called Tibetan Buddhist Monastery Collections Today. Christian worked with colleagues and monastic communities to document and represent monastery collections in Ladakh and Mustang. And together with Kunzang Namgyal Lama and Chiara Bellini, he has helped to shape the Chemri Monastery Museum, and in Kagbeni Monastery in Mustang, his team also documented the collections, redisplayed the Tibetan Buddhist shrine, and produced an interpretive booklet that allows local visitors and international pilgrims alike to encounter these objects with fresh eyes. So this sustained engagement with living monasteries, curatorial practice, and community collaboration really exemplifies the kind of ethical and intellectual commitments that make his scholarship, I think, so influential. So please join me in welcoming Christian Lusenetz, David L. Snellgrove, Senior Lecturer in Tibetan Buddhist Art at SOAS.
First of all, let me say that I feel extremely honored to have this opportunity to present my research to you at this 25th anniversary of the Kensei Foundation. I admire the work since a long time, and so it's a very great honor for me. What I wanted to present today is more an overview of what I've done in the past, or what has interested me in the past through the Western Himalayan monuments and related works in early Tibet, and think about how art history gives us a different story from what we can gather from the texts. And so I'm kind of reflecting on that. So over the last 50 years, great progress has been made in assessing early Tibetan art. That is, art predating the Gelugpa hegemony. The Lhasa Chokang, the monasteries Thabo and Alchi, Shalu Monastery, Tensattil, the main monuments of Gyantse, Gonkachöde, and a number of Guge period monuments are accessible through monographs and comprehensive documentation. Furthermore, much of the photography predating the Cultural Revolution, including that taken during Giuseppe Tucci's diverse expeditions, is now accessible in some form. For early portable art, Ulrich von Schröder's documentation of sculpture still preserved in Tibet and the relative abundance of Taklung school paintings from the 13th to the 15th centuries, now collected in a 2-volume publication by Jane Casey, are particularly illuminating. Much of this pioneering research has focused on art historical questions, such as the object state, the identities of the deities depicted, and the origin of the style. Note the Pala style designation in von Schröder's description. These questions resonate with art and museum worlds that dominate the public presentation of early Tibetan art. In this context, early dates and foreign artists convey exclusivity, as is evident from past research on the so-called Fort Tara, which was attributed to the 11th century and to an Indian artist, but in fact has a clear Tibetan provenance and context that makes it datable between 1175 and 1189. I've always been more interested in understanding what a particular monument or object tells us about the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet. Of course, the correct attribution of the depicted and interpreted is a necessary prerequisite for exploring this question, as is a consideration of the intent behind financing the making in the first place. Let us take this Taklung school portrait of Taklung Tangpa Chenpo as an example, which provides no definite clue for its attribution. It depicts the Tibetan teacher seated within the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya. Given its content, it represents the practice of Guru Yoga, in which the practitioner exchanges the deity with his own teacher. The deity in this case is the Buddha itself, residing in the Mahabodhi temple, recognizable by his short neck, and shown seated opposite the practitioner in the bottom row. It is the depiction of this practice, as much as the distinct style used, that makes it likely for me that this painting is to be attributed to the first decades of the 13th century, as the practitioner must have met the teacher before his passing in 1210. The transmission of Buddhism to Tibet coincided with the development of more advanced forms of esoteric Buddhism in India. Thus, multiple forms of Buddhism reached Tibet during the imperial period, which in Tibetan historiographic literature is referred to as the early spread of Buddhism in Tibet. This wooden door of the Chokang documents some of the layering through the addition of Vajrapurusha in the top right. The later spread of Buddhism in Tibet from the late 10th century onwards was dominated by the adoption of the highest tantric teachings of India, the ultimate of which, the color chakra, was contemporary with its transmission. It thus is indispensable to see the transmission of Buddhism in the light of the transformation of Buddhism itself. Thereby, the esoteric nature of teachings involved leads to a number of theoretical issues that need to be considered when researching the development of early Tibetan art. Namely, the secrecy of the teachings led to a variable time lag between the emergence of the teaching in texts and its expression in art. The paucity of art-relevant details in the root tantras required a commentarial process that expressed itself in exclusive transmission lineages. And the strength of the visual traditions ultimately fashioning the distinct character of Tibetan Buddhist art. In this process, Tibetans sought to make sense of the diversity of received forms by favoring commonalities among tantric traditions over differences, an approach that is also defined the seminal studies of David Snellgrove and Kimiaki Tanaka listed here. They take advantage of the fact that the historically most successful tantric concepts are those that could be linked to the earlier teachings. With this wider context laid out, we can now move to the three themes around which I've organized the talk: secrecy, exclusivity, and fashion. Most of the examples I can cite date to the later spread of Buddhism in Tibet and beyond, as only then is there sufficient art historical evidence. Secrecy is probably the most important issue to consider when studying esoteric Buddhist art. After all, the purpose of art is to visually communicate something to an audience, whether to a select few or to a wider public. Tantric Buddhism, in contrast, is supposed to be secret. Creating a permanent artistic expression weakens that secrecy. Accordingly, early esoteric Buddhist texts describe the use of temporal ritual spaces and ephemeral images, an aspect that has been incorporated into Tibetan Buddhist ritual in the form of the much more sophisticated tradition of making sand mandalas, constructed from colored sand over many hours of dedicated and patient work. These mandalas are destroyed once they have fulfilled their ritual function. Parts of the sacred sand that served as the deity's habitation may live on as an object of devotion, but the majority is disposed of in a clean water body. As a rule of thumb, we may assume that the secrecy of a particular esoteric teaching was weakened once a higher teaching replaced it, making it more likely to be depicted in art, particularly in public contexts. This stratification is also reflected in the classification of Tantric Buddhist texts. The emergence of the use of permanent objects in esoteric ritual is difficult to trace, in part because it's unclear how public some of the earliest objects were. If we take the Famence reliquary deposit as an example, which contained a group of nested containers around the finger bone relic, one of these depicts the full Vajradhatu assembly. Was this produced for the relic and thus never to be seen? Or was it made for another purpose and then reused in this particular context? Whatever the answer is, it is clear that we do not have a contemporary Indian depiction of this type. That the periphery was more ready to undermine secrecy through depictions is also indicated by this Vajraguhya mandala from the library cave of Dunhuang. This painting is much more likely to have been made for a wider public. Early depictions were less explicit than texts. For example, not depicting the deity's consort. If this bronze of Jakasambara is as early as the museum attributes it to is highly doubtful. Not only is there nothing comparable from the early 8th century, but secrecy remained the theme in early Western Himalayan monuments for centuries later. When Thabo Monastery was founded by West Tibetan royalty in 996, its sculptural program was related to the Vairocana Abhisambodhitantra. The main deity is a meditating Vairocana, as indicated by the prominent lions supporting the Buddha's throne. This iconography may well reflect the well-known conservative attitude of its founders. Nevertheless, only 46 years later, this sculptural program was considered outdated and was complemented by a Vajradhatu Mandala assembly placed within the assembly hall. The two programs of Thabo are thus not complementary, as in the twin mandalas of the Shingon tradition, but successive, with the restoration updating the temple's original iconographic program. From the little we know from old photographs, the development in West Tibet mirrored that in Central Tibet. Here too, the Vajradhatu Mandala was the highest tantric subject depicted in public monuments in the 11th and 12th centuries. In fact, the most accessible parts usually emphasized three family configurations, just as in the first phase of Thabo. But the Thabo main temple also features a second main topic, a Dharmadhatu Vagishvara Manjushri Mandala, the central deities of which were recognized at an early stage of research. But these deities preside over the full mandala assembly, which is distributed throughout the temple and represents a complete Buddhist path. The photograph on the right shows on the left, of course, shows the right half of the main deities of the assembly on the west wall in their context. The plan on the right shows the deities of the entire assembly, color-coded by their respective Buddha families. Except for the 5 Buddhas, the sculptures of the Vajradhatu Mandala are an integral part of this second mandala assembly. The two intertwined mandalas also explain why we have 2 sets of 16 bodhisattvas in the ambulatory, occupying the higher position. The Dharmadhatu Mandala can be read as the secret main subject of the Thabo main temple. In slightly later Western Himalayan monuments, this topic takes the position immediately to the left of the main theme, usually a Vajradhatu Mandala. Here, the earliest of these depictions at Nako place the outermost deities outside the circle of the mandala. And at Tunkar, in Ngari, this topic has been represented on the ceiling of the cave, making it the overarching theme. Only the identification of each individual deity in this mandala made me realize why this mandala may have been so popular. Also, the Dharmadhatu Mandala remains dedicated to the 5 Buddhas. An 8-armed form of Manjushri replaces Vairocana in its center. In addition, each of the Buddhas is 8-armed, as are the goddesses in the corners. These goddesses are associated with the Buddhas, as shown by the matching colors. This concept is not inherent in the Yoga Tantras, but has been incorporated under the influence of the highest Yoga Tantra, in particular the Guhya Samaja. Further, the deities in the middle palace of this mandala comprise of groups of 12 goddesses each, the names of which are telling. In the east are the goddesses representing the stages of the Bodhisattva's career, the Bhumi. In the south are the goddesses personifying the diverse perfections, the Paramita, with the perfection of wisdom, Prajna Paramita, the only four-armed deity among them. In the west are the personifications of the controls or powers, Vashita, which a bodhisattva gains on his path to Buddhahood. And the north is occupied by personification of spells, Dharani. They represent the esoteric accomplishments of the bodhisattva and complement the others, who represent mainstream Mahayana concepts. Thus, the Dhammadhatu Mandala not only incorporates the entire bodhisattva path, but also includes the crucial highest Yoga Tantra concept without openly displaying it. It thus hints at the highest Yoga Tantra practice within a milieu that publicly promoted Yoga Tantra. Also, Tibetans classified the Dhammadhatu Vagishvara Manjushri Mandala as a Yoga Tantra. It may well be a substitute for the Guhya Samaja Tantra. This perspective is supported by the temple of Ratni, the home village of the great translator Rinchen Sangpo, where the main deities of the Vajradhatu of the Guhya Samaja Mandala were depicted in a style clearly associated with the sculptures of the Dabo main temple. These deities were, of course, depicted without their consorts. Nevertheless, it is only the late 12th or early 13th century that the Vajradhatu Mandala is replaced by the two Guhya Samaja Mandalas on the main wall of a monument, with the Vajradhatu Mandala taking a secondary position. In the early 13th century, the Vajradhatu Mandala itself is reconfigured in the light of the highest Yoga Tantras, as is evident on the middle floor of the Alchi Sumtsek, where the goddesses originally surrounding Vairocana become the Buddha's consorts. At Alchi, the litany of names of Manjushri, the Manjushri Namasangiti, has also been reinterpreted in the light of the highest Yoga Tantras. The two main temples of Alchi Chöskor preserve distinct versions of the Vajradhatu Mandala that goes back to this text as interpreted in the highest Yoga Tantra commentary by Vilasavajra. Also, we do not have the commentary literature that led to these depictions, or not for all of them. The West Tibetan interpretations of these themes were individuals' choices. It is striking, for example, that the contemporary monuments at Alchi and nearby Mangyu preserve distinct interpretations of the Vajradhatu Mandala. With Alchi Monastery, founded by the Zhou clan, and Mangyu by the Mer family, these appear to be competing interpretations by monks of these noble families, rather than based on specific transmission lineages. In fact, the presence of a Drigong lineage in the lantern of the Alchi Sumtsek marks a turning point in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, as it documents the emergence of the so-called new schools, which emphasize the direct derivation of their teachings from India. The direct derivation of teachings from India has been a point of contention since the establishment of the West Tibetan Kingdom, with many of the teachings circulating there dismissed as inauthentic by royal teachers. These ordinances of the West Tibetan kings are the most apparent expression of a process that took place throughout Tibet in the 11th and 12th centuries. Nevertheless, Alchi contains a number of depictions that have not been included in the Tibetan canon, such as several representations of 22-armed form of Avalokiteshvara, or the 6-armed Mahashantitara, here in an earlier depiction preserved in the assembly hall. As her prominent representations indicate, at Alchi this goddess was worshipped independently. While it is possible that its practice derived from Kashmir, she is not independently represented in later Tibetan art. It is thus likely that texts pertaining to her practice were weeded out during the formation of the Tibetan canon. The direct derivation from India is visually expressed in two ways: through Indian teachers and their Tibetan key disciples. In the fourth Tara mentioned above, the pair of Atisha and Tomten in the upper corners directly above the deity fulfill this role. With the highest tantric teachings, the Indian teacher is typically a Mahasiddha, but early depictions focus less on distinct Mahasiddhas than groups of them. The earliest paintings of mandalas, for example, show many of them occupying the surrounding channel ground. Only a few bear individual features, such as the Siddha dancing with a dog under his arm, which may represent Kukuripa. This is a detail of a Nepalese painting of Chakrasamvara, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Remarkably, the entire channel ground is depicted within a Vajra enclosure, reminiscent of the Vajra cage described in visualization practice. As Matthew Kapstein has shown, groups of Mahasiddhas appear in later transmission texts, and the group of 84 of them likely derives from a context in which Indian and Tibetan scholars collaborated in the early 12th century. The Dhoti of the Bodhisattva Manjushri in the Alchi Sumtsek is the earliest depiction of this topic of 84 Mahasiddhas, as described by Abhaya Datra. Nevertheless, only a small subset can be identified individually, such as another potential Kukuripa now seated on his dog companion. The Mahasiddha at the bottom center, singled out in a larger medallion, is Padamba Sangye, who in this context represents the transmission of the Siddha tradition to Tibet. I've long hesitated to identify this naked dark Siddha found in 3 of the Alchi monuments, as I could not link him to the Drikung school. But the study of a painting in another Drikung school temple at Alchi, the Shangrong Lakang, made his function clear by placing him at the beginning of the transmission of the Siddha tradition to Tibet. Here he was the first of 4 figures that continued as a distinct group of 80, not 80, instead of 84, Indian Siddhas emphasized by the Drikung school. And so these 4 complement the original set of 80. This fabulous late 12th century painting depicts various forms of Vajrayogini, and it may document an early transmission lineage from a group of Siddhas to Tibet. The upper area includes the lay tantric adept, identified by caption as Vairocana Vajra. He too can be taken as standing for the transmission of the Siddha tradition to Tibet, but here specifically in reference to Vajrayogini. That Vairocana Vajra was appreciated in Tibet can also be inferred from a high-quality bronze image documented in Chuksang village in Lower Mustang, which likely depicts him. As Dan Martin has shown, by the mid-12th century, records of individuals who transmitted certain teachings were written down. The earliest depiction of such a record probably dates to the late 12th century and can be ascribed to a Kagyu school context. In this context, the disciples of Pagmadhupa Dorje Gyalpo appear to have played a special role, depicting the teacher in the crown of the Buddha. A deity and siddhas are present at the beginning of each such transmission. The disciple on the right side of the Buddha's lotus is likely also the commissioner of this unique painting. In my reading, early lineage transmissions appear to emphasize the exclusivity of the teachings transmitted. Yet, within the Kagyu schools, the main tradition remains unchanged. What appears to be exclusive is the distinct set of teachings each master is associated with. Early Kagyu paintings emphasize Chakrasamvara alongside Guhya Samaja. In this drawing, the footprints of Jigten Sungren, the founder of the Drigong school, share the throne with Chakrasamvara. On the sides of the lineage in the top row, the broader doctrinal context is included by adding Vajrasattva, Akshobhya, Shakyamuni, and the medicine Buddha. And the siddhas on the sides also appear to represent a range of subsidiary teachings, even if they cannot be identified individually. A composition similar to that in the previous paintings has also been provided the context for the depiction of the teacher at the Dashigomang Churton at Alchi, a fact that further consolidates the Drigong affiliation of later monuments at the site. Paintings documenting the Sakya lineage transmission via Virupa for both Hevajra and the Lamdre transmissions are considerably later, indicating that the full transmission lineage became a topic only in response to the developments in the Kagyu school. Of course, its emphasis on Virupa is documented much earlier, and this painting stands out because it predates 1251, the year of the passing of Sakya Pandita Khyentse Gyaltsen, who consecrated it. This painting is also remarkable for its depiction of the 84 Mahasiddhas in a Neva painting style, a style that became characteristic for commissions of that school. Early Kagyu paintings are also among the first to declare the main teachers of their transmissions as awakened beings, placing them in the center of compositions with the frontality, gestures, and sitting posture of the Buddha. It is only their distinct facial features and the Tibetan monastic dress that distinguishes the teacher portrait from the Buddha image. This is one of many frontal paintings of Taklung Tangpa Chenpo that document the development of the Taklung school painting from the early 13th to the mid-14th century. Note that the early Kagyu school paintings are also the earliest depictions for public consumption in which a deity couple is shown. With sculptures, as in this portrait of Pagmadhupa, the relationship to the Buddha image is even more obvious, as these are frontal and often the earth-touching gesture is used. Interestingly, later Taklung paintings are often less explicit, depicting the central hierarch looking sideways, as in this Taklung school portrait of Pagmadhupa. At the same time, the message that he is an awakened being is reinforced by showing him with scenes from his previous lives along the sides and the activities of his last life in relation to the Taklung school at the bottom. Among the previous lives depicted along the sides of the paintings are several Siddha incarnations. By the 14th century, the notion that Tibetan teachers were past Indian Mahasiddhas was used to reinforce the Tantric transmission from India. As is evident in this exceptional painting today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In this painting, the central Mahasiddha, Jnanatapa, is depicted as a direct disciple of Lalitavajra, a pupil of Tilopa, and as the previous incarnation of Sangye Önpo, thus reinforcing the Kagyu transmission in the late 13th century. I wonder whether this reinforcement was necessary by the early 14th century, as the exclusivity of the transmission had already been weakened by the Tibetan schools assimilating each other, especially the Kagyus. The earliest Tibetan paintings are easy to recognize by the distinctive dress of the Tibetan monks and lay followers depicted in them. Neither the teachers in the top row nor the monk kneeling in the bottom right corner wear the Tibetan monastic robes as they become common in later depictions. The same is true for the Alchi Drikung lineage, especially when compared with the way the local monks are represented on the other side of the same lantern. Also, the artist was unfamiliar with the distinct central Tibetan monastic dress. He must have received some instruction to depict the sleeveless vest and the patched robe. But the Alchi depictions of Drigungpa, the first three in the top row, quickly adopt the way monastic dress is represented in central Tibet, which became standard with Kagyu paintings and influenced later depictions of Tibetan monks. This does not necessarily mean that the earlier dress was so different, but its visual representation certainly was. To take an example of the Taklung school, both the facial features and dress communicated in early portraits of Taklung Tangpa Chenpo establish a distinct appearance. The recognizability of the key masters of the tradition is, of course, intended, and it may well be that it stems from an image that was meant to represent the true likeness of the teachers. But these distinct faces are also highly idealized, a fact that becomes particularly apparent in the depiction of the eyes. These portraits are from a painting that shows both Pakmadupa and Taklung Tangpa Chenpo in distinct forms. The former directly comparable to the sculpture portrait which we have already seen, and the latter matching with other portraits already presented. Comparing several portraits of Tangpa Chenpo from the early 13th to the early 14th centuries, we can observe that the distinct facial features diminish. Dress remains a constant, and the monastery and surrounding deities expand, adopting new elements that have become characteristic of the Taklung school at the time. Among the new elements are the four great kings, additional subsidiary deities, and distinct yellow hats for the secondary depictions of Taklung Tangpa. The lineage remains the same as is in the earliest painting, leading up to the main teacher. But it is expanded in the text on the back, in which further abbots are being paid homage to. Thus, in the case of the lineage, the visual coherence was preferred over updating the lineage. Representing the speech and mind form of the Lama, these inscriptions, shaped as a stupa, convert the painting into a body. A major absence of the discussion so far is the Nimga school and its main sources of teachings, Padmasambhava. While Padmasambhava and his teachings already appear in Dunhuang texts and become increasingly important during and after the second transmission, none of his depictions predates the 13th century. And by then, his legend has already formed to a large extent. Thabo Monastery preserved two depictions that were painted into the lower chamber of stupas, the one here, the larger and earlier one of those. The feathered hat and the 8 manifestations are already there, but the dress is distinct in early images. The Heruka mandala in the McCormick collection may even be earlier. It not only represents Padmasambhava in the top left above the mandala, but even represents him as part of the mandala assembly itself. But he truly becomes mainstream when the Kagyu schools adopt his teachings and incorporate him in their depictions. For the Taklung school, his inclusion is datable to around to the 1270s, as evidenced by the portraits of Kuyelwa and Sangye-eun. In Taklung paintings, he appears together with Padamba Sangye, who in this case must stand for the transmission of Chö, rather than generically for the Siddha tradition, as was the case earlier. There is much more to be said about each of these themes I have addressed in this talk, and there are many more examples in each of the cases presented. But I hope this overview has demonstrated that the visual material that has come down to us presents an alternative framework for understanding the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet that complements what we can gain from the textual sources. The public outlook of the visual and the socially controversial aspects of tantric teachings meant that even though the highest yoga tantras were already practiced for 3 centuries in Alchi, they were only depicted in the monuments of the early 14th century, in the Lakang Soma, the new temple. And what's new is really this type of depiction. By then, the highest tantric teachings were already represented in encyclopedic fashion, reproducing the compositions of portable paintings on the walls and integrating teacher portraits. As at Thabo earlier, what was new in this layer is the tantric iconography represented. The central topic, however, remained a Drigong version of a composition that goes back to the description of the superior painting in the Manjushri Mula Kalpa, which is said to liberate at the mere sight of it. Of course, the power of the visual has long been recognized in Buddhism. Less recognized is that images may also have impacted Buddhist texts, as demonstrated by the similarities between the superior painting of the Manjushri Mula Kalpa and the Muhammad Nari Stele. To me, this continuity, stretching from early Mahayana Buddhism to the 18th century, is the ultimate visual example of the continuity and change within a religious tradition. Thank you.